From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hello, I'm Gail Shirazi of the Israel Judaica section here at the Library of Congress. And before we start today's program, I want to briefly mention our next program on May 29th on Rescue in the Philippines, Refuge from the Holocaust. We're screening the film. It's a documentary film, so hope to see you there. There are flyers in the back table. Welcome to today's program, Voyage of the St. Louis, co-sponsored by Library Services here at the Library of Congress and the Library of Congress Professional Association Hebrew Language Table. The program is presented today in honor of the 75th anniversary of the sailing of the St. Louis and in honor of Jewish American Heritage Month. We have one of the passengers from the St. Louis with us today, Eva Wiener, sitting right there. And I'm wondering whether there are any other passengers or families of passengers that are here with us today, and if so, could you stand? So just Eva, oh, there's another one. Thank you. I would also like to thank a few people. Mishlin Amir from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, who's the reason this program is here today. She arranged the speakers and had the idea for the program. Roberta Schaefer, Associate Librarian of Congress. Beecher Wiggins, our ABA Director. Audrey Fisher and the staff of the Public Affairs Office. Sue Vita in Music Division, who let us have the wonderful Whitall Pavilion. And Galina Teverovsky of the IJ section. Also, of course, Marvin Kalb and our panelists, Martin Goldsmith and Diane Afumado. I will be stepping aside as soon as I introduce Mr. Kalb, and he will take over the program. Marvin Kalb spent 30 years as an award-winning reporter for CBS News and NBC News. He's written or co-authored 11 nonfiction books and 2 fiction books, and he's currently working on a new book, The Soviet Spring, The Rise and Challenge of Putin's Russia. He's a non-resident senior fellow with the foreign policy programs at Brookings and is a senior advisor to the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. He focuses on the impact of media and public policies and politics, and is an expert on national security with a focus on U.S. relations with Russia, Europe, and the Middle East. And it is with great pleasure I introduce Marvin Kalb. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail, very much, and thank you all for coming to this program. Very quickly to set the stage, Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933, and 5 years later, in the fall of 1938, there was the Kristallnacht, when the Nazis decided to destroy as best they could as many Jewish shops and synagogues as they could in Germany. And the German Jews got the message very quickly. Many of them had the message earlier. And they decided that it would be good to get out. And more than 900 of them managed to get on the St. Louis. And I noticed the title here, Voyage of the St. Louis, and of course that entire journey has been written about in a book and a movie as the Voyage of the Damned. And that is probably an understatement, because they never were able to land in Cuba. Their destination had to go back, and roughly, I don't know the exact numbers, 2/3 of them somehow managed to survive World War II. A third of them did not. So when they could not land in Cuba, they went back to their deaths at different times and in different places. We're really privileged to have 2 people who know about this subject and will talk to us about it. One of them is Martin Goldsmith, to my left. Martin is the host and classical music programmer for Symphony Hall on Sirius XM Satellite Radio, and he hosted NPR's Performance Today from 1989 to 1999. He's the author of 2 books. The first, The Inextinguishable Symphony. He can tell you about that. I hope he will. And the second is Alex's Wake, which has to do with his grandfather and uncle, who were 2 of the more than 900 on the St. Louis. Also joining us today, Dr. Diane Afumado. She received her PhD and MA in Contemporary History from the University of Paris in Nanterre. She had a fellowship at the Holocaust Museum. She has written extensively on this subject, and she's conducted research especially on the St. Louis Odyssey through the eyes of Captain Schroeder, who was the captain of the boat, the St. Louis. And I would like to ask Dr. Afumado to start first, and then Martin to pick it up after that. Please, Doctor.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I want to thank the organizer. Thank you, Gail, for putting this program together. And thank you, I want to really thank my colleague and dear friend, Micheline Amir, for organizing this. So I'm going to present a PowerPoint to you and try to summarize in 20 minutes the whole story of the St. Louis. So please, if you have any question, I can talk more about the St. Louis at the end. So first of all, I want to say a few words about the Jewish population in Germany and in the Reich in general just before World War II. The Jewish population in Germany before the war was about 1% of the total population of Germany. And as you know, you mentioned this already, but as you know, the Jewish refugees fled Germany mostly, half of them, mostly between 1938 and 1939, and especially after the Evian Conference, and you can see one of the photographs of the Evian Conference there on the PowerPoint. The Evian Conference in July 1938 that basically tried to solve the problem of the refugee crisis, but it ended up being sort of a failure. And I'm going very fast here because there was a lot to say about the Evian Conference. But roughly in 1938 and 1939, there were not many options for the refugees and for the Jews, and they could go mostly to Shanghai and Cuba. And you can imagine that when you were a Jew from Germany or Austria, let's say the Reich in general, that was probably not your first choice, Shanghai or Cuba. But that was the only choice you basically had when you were thinking of massive immigration. I'm not talking about individual immigration, I'm talking about really a large number of people fleeing Germany. So before I start really telling you the whole story, I want to say a few words about the Highback Company that owned the St. Louis boat. The Highback Company was not the only company at that time. In the 1930s, there were many others. The Highback Company was German, but there were many other companies in France or Great Britain, the Netherlands, and most of them actually carried Jews on board, Jews who were trying to flee Germany in 1938 and 1939. What I'm trying to say is that the Highback Company was not the only one, and the refugee crisis really touched all those companies of cruise liners at the end of the 1930s. The Highback was created in 1847, and it was mostly a commercial fleet that was totally destroyed during World War I and rebuilt afterwards, and reached its golden age in the 1920s. So imagine, this company that was really that had a lot of boats, a lot of vessels, a lot of luxurious liners, and the St. Louis was one of the most luxurious boats at that time. What is interesting is that in order to emigrate to Cuba in the 1930s, at the end of the 1930s, you needed a lot of documents. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but it was actually a lot of documentation that you had to gather in order to be able to enter the country, let alone, buying the boat, the ticket on the boat. So this is an example of the immigration identification card of one of the St. Louis passengers, and basically most of the St. Louis passengers had what we call a landing permit. This is not a visa per se, and this is a good document. This is totally a legal document, but this is not a visa. And but just remember that term, landing permit, because that's what most of the passengers had. This is a photograph of some of the passengers boarding the St. Louis, and I really like this photograph because it gives me a chance to tell you more about the passengers themselves and the world that they are stepping in. Most of the passengers were families. So the oldest passenger on the St. Louis was born at the end of the 19th century in the 1980s, 1990s. And the youngest one, 1880. Sorry, I'm not good at dates and numbers, especially English is not my native speaker, so thank you for correcting me. So 1890s, 1880s. Backward. And the youngest passenger was actually a baby born in January 1939. But what I'm trying to say is that we are not in illegal immigration here. This is a perfectly legal immigration. Those people had legal documents to immigrate to Cuba, so they were leaving Germany with the whole family. And also, what is interesting is that by boarding the St. Louis, they're going to step into a world of luxury that they didn't have access to. I mean, even the wealthiest passengers on the St. Louis, they were basically they belonged to most of the categories, social categories of the Jews in Germany and Austria. But even the most wealthy passengers on the St. Louis didn't have access anymore to that kind of luxury because of the persecutions in Germany. So when they board the St. Louis, this is basically what they're going to see. I chose that photograph on purpose because, there are many other locations on the boat that were actually photographed by the passengers. But this is really one of the most beautiful photographs of the dining room in the St. Louis. So just imagine a very luxurious vessel, one of the most beautiful of that fleet. Imagine the Titanic, but with the decoration of the 1930s. So, just to make it short. And they're going to have a lot of possibilities to try to enjoy the voyage. But you can imagine that it's going to be difficult for them. So they need some time because they go from the persecution since 1933 to this kind of atmosphere by just boarding the boat. But after 24 hours, 48 hours for some of them, they're going to try to relax and to enjoy as much as possible the pleasure of that journey. I want to say a few words about the crew on the St. Louis and the captain. This is a photograph of the chef on the St. Louis, and you have to imagine that the crew is about 200 people. The captain of the boat, Captain Gustav Schröder, is a German who is very proud of his country. I usually define him as a romantic German because he really is in love of Germany. He really loves his country and he hates the Nazis and he hates what the Nazis are doing to Germany. And he's the captain on board. So he tells, he gathers the crew just before the departure of the St. Louis to tell them that on board, it is out of question to persecute those passengers because they are Jewish. So, the Nazi laws don't have any room on board. I mean, the crew will be at the service of the passengers like, they would be at the service of any other passengers who would go on a cruise, even if this is not a cruise per se, but they would be at the service of the passengers on the St. Louis, so they will serve them like anyone else. And he also gives the crew members the choice to leave the boat if anyone disagrees with this, and no one left. So all the crew, the whole crew is at the service of the passengers, and the passengers are going to be able to enjoy the facility on the boat, including the menus, and this is one of the menus of the on the boat, and the menus were absolutely outstanding. They can also relax by, dancing in the ballroom. You can see those people smiling and dancing and trying to do the best they can and to enjoy as much as possible that journey between Hamburg and the Havana. Some others would play shuffleboard on the deck of the St. Louis. But what is interesting in here is that we have documentation about most of the passengers, and two of my colleagues at the Holocaust Museum traced the fates of the passengers of each of them at the St. Louis, and so we know exactly what happened to them. So here you can see Werner Lemberg playing shuffleboard on the St. Louis, but he was previously to that voyage arrested, probably most likely during Kristallnacht, and sent to Dachau, to the concentration camp in Dachau. And on that document, which is a document from the International Tracing Service collection that we have at the museum, you can see his prisoner number on the top of this card. And this is his office card in Dachau. So he was able to leave the camp on one condition: it was not to return to Germany ever. So this is just to show you that all the categories of the passengers were on the St. Louis. There were also about 200 children on the St. Louis, and I specifically enjoyed the photograph. I really like the photograph with the swimming pool. Because that gives me a chance also to tell you what happened, in Germany. During the 1930s, the Jews were not allowed in swimming pools in Germany. So those children who are enjoying, swimming in that little swimming pool on the St. Louis, for the youngest one, they probably didn't even know how to swim because they never had a chance to learn. So you can imagine that, this is very important, and everything would be done on board, thanks to the captain and the crew, to make that journey as enjoyable as possible. So when they arrived in Cuba on May 27, 1939, this slide actually gives me a chance to talk about the political crisis in Cuba. The St. Louis, when the St. Louis arrives in Cuba, they actually, the passengers cannot disembark. But no one tells them why they can't disembark, because there is a political crisis in Cuba, and also no one explains anything to them. But the political crisis is the following. So you probably don't know much about the president, the Cuban president, because you have absolutely no reason to know anything about him. But you probably heard about Batista, maybe not in the 1930s, but Batista was already doing something. So the landing permits that the passengers acquired were actually sold thanks to a huge traffic of documents that was organized by the Secretary of Immigration, Manuel Benitez Jr., and he was supported by the president's main opponent, political opponent, Batista. So Batista was trying to destabilize the president, behind the scene through the Secretary of Immigration, and in order to reestablish his political power, the president wanted to put an end to immigration, so he decided to issue a decree just a few days before the St. Louis actually left Hamburg. This is not against the St. Louis passengers. The president didn't even know anything about the St. Louis passengers. They were just immigrants, or they were just, legal passengers among other boats that would come to Cuba. But, he wants to put an end to the immigration, so that's, why he issued a decree. So no one would actually really disembark legally in Cuba, and facing that crisis, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee decided to send on location one of its representative, Lawrence Berenson, to negotiate with the Cuban authorities, but nothing would happen, and even the captain of the St. Louis, Gustav Schroeder, would actually put on civilian clothes and try to negotiate with the Cuban authorities as well, but nothing good will come up of this. So basically, the captain cannot do anything, but you can imagine that for the family members and the friends of the St. Louis passengers who are already in Cuba, it's very difficult because they don't know anything, they don't know what's going on, and they try to communicate with their families on board. So they would hire little boats like this one, and they would try to go around the boat and try to communicate with their families and friends, trying to bring them, exotic fruits and try to, give them some news about what's going on. This is also another photographs of those boats. I'm going quickly because I want to move on to the next step of the St. Louis. So after a while, the negotiations were probably over in Cuba. But the captain receives the order to leave the Cuban waters, but he decides to navigate between Cuba and the United States because more than 700 passengers were actually registered on the Quota list of immigration in the United States. That means that any time, it could be a question of days, months, or years, their number would come up. So eventually, their final destination would be the United States. So the captain brings the St. Louis in front of Miami in the harbor of Miami, and the passengers can see the light of Miami and the palm trees. But there is, for the United States, I'm going to give you a little overview of the general political context, so you can understand why the United States did not let the passengers in. You have to understand that it would have been just 900 plus people, so it's not a big deal for the United States to welcome those people. But just imagine that if the country had opened the doors to those people, thousands of hundreds would have followed them because there were more and more immigrants and Jewish refugees who tried to escape from Germany and the Reich. So that by anticipating that situation, it would have opened the door to more massive immigration, and the government didn't want to do this. Plus, in the United States, don't forget that there was the Immigration Act of 1924, and so the quota, were the quota. So it was out of question to make an exception and to raise the number, to raise the quota to accept more refugees. There was also a certain level of anti-Semitism among the population and also among the State Department. And when you read the correspondence between, among the State Department, you can realize that they were very much afraid of welcoming more refugees, and especially Jewish refugees, because they were associated them with communism and the fifth column. So I'm just giving you several reasons, but there are much more. But I don't want to talk too much about this. So the St. Louis had to go back to Germany, technically. So between, you can imagine on the way back that the atmosphere on board is no longer the same. But on the way back, the JDC would ask its representative in Europe, based in Paris, Maurice Tropper, to negotiate with some European countries. In that case, it was Belgium, France, Great Britain, and Holland. And it's a very long and complicated negotiation that involved also representatives of the Jewish communities in those four countries. And it's basically a race against the clock and almost like a poker game for Maurice Tropper to have those countries agree on accepting more refugees. So to make a very long and complicated story short, especially those negotiations, eventually Belgium, France, Great Britain, and Holland would accept the passengers, and they would be dispersed almost equally between the four countries. But just imagine that, from the moment that Cuba refused them or, refused the St. Louis passengers to disembark, they became illegal immigrants because they had legal documents to immigrate to Cuba. So they would be in Europe with basically illegal documents, and it couldn't work. So without moving, without doing anything, their legal status changed just by, the decision of Cuba, and they would become illegal immigrants. So basically, they would become almost refugees. Not quite, because refugee is a legal status. So I just want to give you one example. The St. Louis passengers ended up in those four countries, except for those who actually went to England, to Great Britain. The others became, we are in June 1939, and the war almost, the war is, at the door. So for those who actually ended up in those three countries, France, Belgium, and Holland, they were in the same situations as all the refugees who found refuge in those three countries during the 1930s. So you can see, for example, here photographs, a very beautiful photograph of Ilse Karliner on the boat on the deck of the St. Louis, and smiling. You can see her also here talking to some other passengers. And on the other photograph on your left, this is a photograph that was taken in Mirbeau in France. It was like a home, because you have to remember that those people were held by Jewish organizations because they couldn't support themselves. So she's there and she's almost safe since she's in France in a home, but France was occupied and was also had the Vichy government, who was very, very anti-Semitic. So, they had to face not only the anti-Semitism of the Germans, but also of the Vichy government. So here we know that Ilse Karliner, after, being on the St. Louis, going to Cuba, to Miami, and coming back to France, ended up in Mirbeau in France and was actually arrested, rounded up in November 1942. And her name is on that list. She was deported from Drancy to Auschwitz and perished in 1942 in Auschwitz. Just two more slides to finish, and you can read the numbers. So 231 passengers of the St. Louis actually perished during the Holocaust. Those people could have been saved if they had disembarked in Cuba. The St. Louis returned to Germany after a 7-month cruise, and was totally destroyed in 1944 after being bombed by the Royal Air Force. And so the St. Louis no longer exists, but on photographs, postcards, or leaflets. And I want to just show you a picture of the captain of the boat, Captain Gustav Schroeder, wearing his hat, and you can see a photograph of his hat that we have. We have the hat at the museum. You can imagine when I was a fellow at the museum that, for everybody it's like an artifact. For me, it's his hat. So just by looking at this photograph and looking at the hat, I don't even think of touching it because it's very emotional for me. But, just by looking at the hat, I can actually tell you the whole story of the St. Louis. I don't need any other slide or any other photograph. And this is the book that he actually wrote. And this is a signed copy. And Captain Schroeder died in 1959, and he was awarded a medal by West Germany in 1957, just 2 years before he died, for helping the passengers of the St. Louis. And he was also posthumously honored as the Writers Among the Nations by Yad Vashem in 1993. And if you want to know more, you have a paper outside. I think it's on the table outside with some links and some books on the St. Louis. And these are 2 links that actually we have on the website. This is the exhibition, the online exhibition of the St. Louis that 2 of my colleagues, Sarah Ogilvy and Scott Miller, worked on. And my book, but it's in French. And I'm sorry, but when I started, I wrote this in French, and I still write in French, and I try to write in English. But so this is the book that tells the whole story of the St. Louis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Afamado. It was a fascinating report. Martin Goldsmith, we'd like to hear your report, please.
Thanks so much, Mr. Kalb. Thanks, Dr. Afamado. Thank you also to Micheline Amir and her wonderful colleagues at the Holocaust Museum, who were of such incredible help to me as I did my research for my book. Alas, I do not have a PowerPoint to share with you. I suppose, modestly suggest you go out into the lobby and get a copy of my book, Alex's Wake, because there are many wonderful photographs within the pages of the book, very low tech, I must say. But one of the photographs that I'm most pleased to have discovered with the help of the wonderful people at the Holocaust Museum, when, after Morris Troper of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee brokered the deal that enabled the refugees on board the St. Louis to disembark in either England, France, Belgium, or Holland, all the passengers on board the St. Louis signed a note of appreciation to Mr. Troper. And in the archives of the Holocaust Museum, I discovered a portion of that card, which includes the signatures of my grandfather Alex and my uncle Helmut, and that is reproduced in the book. So yes, Alex Goldschmidt, my grandfather, and Klaus Helmut Goldschmidt, my uncle, were 2 of the more than 900 refugees on board the St. Louis. And 3 years ago, my wife, whom I'm happy to say is standing at the back of our room today, my wife and I retraced their steps, beginning in the small lower Saxony village of Sachsenhagen, where my grandfather Alex was born in 1879, the seventh of 8 children. He was the son and grandson of Pferdehändler, or horse dealers. They came from a long line of people dealing in horse flesh, and they did very well for themselves. Trading horses and raising horses and selling horses was an occupation that was open to the Jews of Germany when so many of the professions were closed to Jews. But my grandfather, Alex, did not want to go into the horse business. He instead went to the northwestern German city of Oldenburg and opened a women's clothing store, the Haus der Mode, the House of Fashion, where apparently all fashionable Oldenburg women shopped for dresses and hats and shoes and accessories and so on. And when Amy and I were on our journey of remembrance, we of course went from Sachsenhagen to Oldenburg and met at the time, 93-year-old woman named Annemarie Boyken, who knew my father and knew my father's younger brother, my uncle Helmut. She confessed to me that she had a crush on both of them and beamed at me the whole evening that we met, because she said I looked so much like my father and like my uncle, and she said it makes me feel years younger to look at you. And then she told a wonderful story about my grandfather. Again, he ran the Haus der Mode, and when Annemarie was 8 or 10 years old, she went with her mother to buy an Easter dress, and she found the perfect frock for the occasion, she said, and she asked her mother to buy it for her, and her mother took one look at the price tag and said, "Well, I'm afraid this dress is too expensive," and Annemarie began to cry. And then the proprietor of the store, my grandfather, Alex Goldschmidt, came over and said, "What's the matter? Aren't you the little girl who knows my sons and who plays marbles with them? What is wrong?" And Annemarie said, "Well, I found this wonderful Easter dress, but my mother says it's too expensive." And at that, my grandfather looked at the price tag and said, "Oh, there's been some mistake. One of my employees marked down the wrong price. Here is the correct price," and named a much lower price. And just like that, Annemarie got the dress that she wanted. She told this story in German to Amy and me, and my hosts were translating the story. But then Annemarie stopped and in English said to me, "That is exactly the kind of man your grandfather was," which was a lovely story for me to learn about. I also learned a little bit about my uncle Helmut, who was a studious young man, not a great student, but a good one, a very poor athlete, for which he was taken to task by the gym teacher of the Altes Gymnasium in Oldenburg, who was a vigorous member of the Nazi Party, and gave my uncle a good deal of trouble for his lack of athletic ability. But if my uncle was not so good at running and jumping, he had a good deal of what I quote J.D. Salinger at one point and referred to my uncle's testicularity, which he demonstrated at a school-wide assembly of the Altes Gymnasium in the autumn of 1938, just a few weeks before Kristallnacht. A member of the Nazi Party came and was an honored speaker to the students and the faculty of the Altes Gymnasium, and he began speaking about the Jewish menace, how the Jews were controlling finance and how they were controlling the media and how they were coming after the flower of German womanhood, and on and on and on. And at one point in the middle of this school-wide assembly, my uncle, aged 17, stood up and shouted, "Das ist alles Lüge! These are all lies." At that point, he turned and strode out of the assembly room. The principal of the school went after him, grabbed him by the arm, dragged him up on stage, slapped him in full view of all of the assembled, and within days, my uncle was kicked out of the school. But one other thing that I was very pleased to discover in Oldenburg, a little note that my grandmother, Tony Behrens, sent to the school shortly after my uncle was evicted from that assembly. Her note was essentially one line saying, "You can't kick my son out of school, he quits." It's the only note that I have in my grandmother's handwriting, and as you might imagine, I'm very proud of her as well. Well, on November 9th, 1938, which Mr. Kalb has mentioned, the night of Kristallnacht, my grandfather, Alex, was arrested. The morning after, he and 42 other adult male Jews of the city of Oldenburg were paraded through the town, past the still smoldering remains of the synagogue on Peterstrasse. They were sent to the prison in Oldenburg, and then the next day again paraded through town to the train station, where they were sent to the concentration camp Sachsenhausen. My grandfather spent the next 5 weeks in Sachsenhausen, was then released in early December of 1938, told he had 6 months to leave the country or else face further arrest. So that is when he booked passage, along with his younger son, my father's younger brother, my Uncle Helmut, booked passage on St. Louis, which is how they became 2 of the more than 900 refugees on board. When they made it back to Europe, they disembarked in France, no doubt at least very, very pleased that they were not back in Germany. But of course that is when their troubles began. And as I say, 3 years ago, my wife and I decided to follow in their footsteps. And if I may just quote a few lines from the first part of the book, the first chapter, I said that I discovered, with the help of the museum, the Holocaust Museum, I learned their itinerary, and the list of all of the towns they spent in those 3 years of captivity. That list of names became as familiar to me as my own address and telephone number. And late one night it came to me what I must do. I knew that I needed to retrace their steps, to set foot on the earth they trod during those final 3 years of initial hope and eventual hopelessness, to see what they saw and to breathe the air they breathed before they breathed their last. I would tell their story as a grandson, a nephew, and an eyewitness. And I write that I packed, along with our luggage and the remains of my father, who had died a few years earlier, and I decided to sprinkle his ashes in the park next to the house where he grew up, because he loved it so much. But I packed the fervent hope that in the coming 6 weeks I might learn much about the ordeal of my grandfather and uncle, yet also find a way to set down my family's long-borne burden, to steer my way out of the churning turbulence of Alex's wake into the calm and peaceful waters of my living family, my friends, and my life. So, as I say, my wife and I began our journey in Sachsenhagen, where my grandfather was born. We went to Oldenburg, where he set up the Haus der Mode. We traveled to Hamburg, where the St. Louis sailed from, where we also paid tribute to some of our musical heroes, the Beatles, who honed their craft over 2 years between 1960 and 1962 along the Reeperbahn in Hamburg, and also to Johannes Brahms, who was born in Hamburg in 1833. We then drove across the Low Countries to meet up metaphorically with Alex and Helmut when they landed in Boulogne-sur-Mer in northern France. We did some research at the Bibliothèque Nationale, the National Library there in Boulogne. And as I write, I was very pleased that for the first time since my 8th grade French class, I actually found a use for the phrase, pardon, où est la bibliothèque? It was very gratifying to see that after all those years, that phrase stuck with me. So we found out a bit of what happened to them while they were in Boulogne-sur-Mer. They then were dispatched to what was called the Agricultural Retraining Center at Martigny-les-Bains, which was a very small village in the northeastern part of France near Nancy. It had been a spa town for many years because of the healing waters, and some of the Jewish refugee organizations in France had set up this agricultural re-education center. And for 2 idyllic months, in July and August of 1939, my grandfather and uncle learned how to raise sheep and to raise chickens. But then came September 1st, 1939, the outbreak of the Second World War, and my grandfather and uncle metamorphosed in the eyes of the French from refugees to enemy aliens, since they still carried German passports, and Germany and France were now at war. They then were sent to a camp in Sion, from there to Montauban, where they were held in an old cookie factory for a month before they were sent to the refugee camp in Agde, which had been set up as a refugee camp for some of the victims of the Spanish Civil War, but then became a holding camp for what the French called the undesirables of France. As of the 3rd day of October 1940, the Statut des Juifs was passed, more or less an echo of the Nuremberg laws. The Vichy government passed the Statut des Juifs, again depriving the Jews of their civil rights, making it impossible for Jews to hold many professions, saying that the Jews had to have yellow signs in their business windows, identifying them as Jewish-run businesses. So they were there in the camp in Agde along the Mediterranean, sent from there to the camp in the Pyrenees called Rivesaltes, where they spent 6 months. From there they wwere sent to the camp in Les Milles in Provence, where they spent a bit more than a year, and they too then were sent via Drancy to Auschwitz, where my grandfather, age 63, was immediately gassed. He was deemed too old to be of any use to the German war machine. My uncle was 21 years old at the time. He was tattooed with the number 59305, sent to barracks number 7 in Auschwitz. He then was transferred to barracks number 20, where he died on October the 9th, 1942, officially of typhus, but very possibly of a lethal injection straight to the heart. So my book, Alex's Wake, tells the story of these 2 journeys, 70 years apart, the journey of my grandfather and uncle on board the St. Louis, and of my wife's and my journey following in their footsteps more than 70 years later. It's been a great pleasure to speak with you today. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you both very much for 2 fascinating reports. I have, as you can imagine, several questions that I'd like to pop to both of you before we go to the audience, and you're invited very much to ask questions as well. Mine, I'd like to start with Martin and then go to Dr. Affumato. Martin, if you could come up. You mentioned in your book, or probably I would not have thought of it before, but you mentioned something that a number of Jews who survived the Holocaust talk about and think about a great deal, whether they share that information with their children or not. And your father chose for a long period of time to put some distance between himself and you and the experience of the Holocaust. And so there's sort of 2 sides of the same question. How did you feel when you found out about it? That you were being denied something? What was your gut feeling then about your father's judgment on that issue, please?
Yes, it's apparently not uncommon for people of my generation, the second generation, the children of survivors of the Holocaust. It is not uncommon to grow up in an atmosphere of secrets and a lack of information. In the first book I wrote, The Inextinguishable Symphony, about my parents and their experiences playing in an all-Jewish orchestra in Nazi Germany between 1935 and 1941, I describe it as sort of borrowing from, of all people, Richard Wagner, his image of the second act of the opera Walküre, which takes place in the house of Hunding. It has a tree growing up through the floor and up through the roof, this immense presence. And I compared the silence in our house to this immense tree. The fate of my parents' families, they all perished during the Holocaust, was something we didn't talk about. My brother once asked my father, why don't we have uncles and aunts, and like all of our friends do? And my father answered very shortly, they died in the war, not wanting to go any deeper than that. He obviously felt a great deal of guilt and shame, which he did pass on to me and to my brother, which I describe as the metaphor of traveling in Alex's wake, the fact that for so long this idea that my father had not done everything he possibly could have to save his father and uncle was a great burden on him. He passed it on to me, and that was when I did find out more of the details. I write in the book that I could simultaneously feel a great deal of anger at my father for not having done everything he possibly could, even though he and my mother were brand new refugees to this country and had very few resources. So I was simultaneously very angry with him, but also full of pity for him as well, since he had so few resources, he had so little that he probably could have done, and was saddled with this horrible feeling of guilt for the rest of his life.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Affumato, my question for you goes back to that moment when the St. Louis, after 6 days in the harbor in Cuba, Havana, found that they could not get into Cuba, and so they tried the U.S. And you gave a couple of very good reasons why the United States turned the St. Louis away. But I'm still left with this question. Actually, two questions. The first is the Secretary of the Treasury was Morgenthau, who was an unafraid, unashamed, unabashed Jew. He spoke on behalf of a lot of Jewish causes. He went in to speak to President Roosevelt time and time again about the Jewish problem. And I don't quite understand his role in all of this. He sent 2 Coast Guard vessels to look after the St. Louis. Captain Schroeder, I believe, said at one point that he was thinking of grounding the St. Louis so that the people, I don't know if that's right, but thinking of grounding the St. Louis so that these people could get off the boat in the U.S. Was Morgenthau protecting the boat, protecting his reputation, protecting the president? Why didn't he do more? That is the question I asked from the vantage point of 2014. I didn't live with him at that time. Please.
Well, actually, there are many things that you can read online or that you can read in some articles that are not totally true about the St. Louis. The story of the Coast Guard, I mean, there is very little information about this, and basically nothing in the archives. It's based on testimonies, but I never found any trace of anything like this in the archives. So it's actually something that needs to be researched a little bit further. And as for the role of Morgenthau, it's, when it comes to the St. Louis, usually I don't get the question about him, but I get the question about Roosevelt. But it's okay. It's hard to imagine that just one person can make the difference. I mean, in that case, even if I'm going to talk about Roosevelt first and then answer your question, but Roosevelt was certainly seen as the most powerful person in the world, but this is the American government, and we cannot do anything without Congress. I mean, the approval of Congress. He cannot do he cannot change the law. The State Department was very, very reluctant to welcoming more refugees, and so it was not his decision only. It's the same thing with anybody in the government, and Morgenthau is one of them. He could advise the president. He could say something. He could put some weight on this, but at the end of the day, I mean, that would have been opening the doors again to more and more refugees. So, I mean, it's not only about humanitarian. We're talking about the St. Louis from the perspective of the passengers here and from the perspective of humanitarian cause. If you look at the story from the government perspective, humanitarian cause is not really what moves governments usually. This is terrible to say, but humanitarian reasons don't usually weigh more than anything else. So this is one of the reasons. As for, I forgot the other one.
No, it was Morgenthau.
So I answered
that.
Everything.
Let me pick that up as well and ask both of you this question. Supposing, and I know it's hard to imagine, but supposing something similar were to happen today, would there have been the same result, do you think? Martin?
Well, the fact is, as Diane mentioned, referred to, there was a certain strain of anti-Semitism in this country in 1938. I quote a Roper poll from that era, which indicates that more than 50%, 53% of the American people who responded to this poll declared that Jews were not like the rest of us, and that it was important that they be restricted in their business practices and their social practices. Only 39% of people responding to this Roper poll said that Jews were like everybody else and should be treated the same. A full 10% of the people responding to this poll said that all Jews should be deported from the United States. And we really need to remember that this was the era of restricted hotels, restricted country clubs. This was a fairly anti-Semitic country in 1938. If something similar were to happen today, I do not certainly see that same level of anti-Semitism in existence today. So I don't see anything along those lines happening. Now, if it were a boat filled with people from other lands, given the anti-immigration stance of many elected officials and many citizens in this country, it's a little hard for me to know exactly what the answer would be.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Fumato, I'd like to have your view, your sense on what would happen if this would have happened today, and to go back to something you were saying earlier as a sort of not justification but explanation of why it is that what happened. Do you feel that governments, what have we learned in the last 75 years? As a matter of fact, if you go back to the St. Louis and you try to think about today, and you take what I'm struggling for here, humanitarian issues, should they not be more central to the construction of our foreign policy? It seemed to me that in the last 2 or 3 decades, there have been efforts on the part of the U.S. government to take into account a humanitarian need and not to stick to the law as literally and rigidly as we have. So the same question to you, what would be your sense now if something similar were to have occurred?
Well, I'm not trying to avoid this, but I'm a historian, so I'm not a political scientist or political advisor. But I think that what we have now, and that they didn't have back then, is a clearer definition of refugees, of legal immigrants, illegal immigrants. So we have something that is supposed to protect those people, and because they are a part of different categories. And if you look at today, the world of today is really a world of globalization. So there is more prevention, there is more also attempt to understand what's going on ahead of time, in terms of humanitarian response to a refugee crisis. So before, we reach that point of basically no return, before, you see people just boarding boats and trying to, go wherever they can, more and more, prevention is done ahead of time. So on location, to try to help those people and to try to prevent them from fleeing their own country, or prevent them from being forced to flee their own country. It doesn't always work, considering the world of today, but it's a world that is basically, you have many wars going on, and it's very difficult to answer that question just in one sentence.
I think that one of the things that I had in mind was the role of the media, actually. And if CNN could stay almost live for about a week on a cruise ship in the Gulf of Mexico, which had some problem with toilets. I wonder if a ship like the St. Louis today, and it was not a mystery, we all knew what was happening at the time, but a ship like that in the harbor with live television 24 hours a day, I have a feeling there'd be a different kind of result. We have about 5 or 7 minutes now for your questions, and if you'd like, just raise your hand. I'll try to spot. Yes, sir.
Did I understand correctly that the reason why the St. Louis was turned back was because of an internal political process going on in Cuba? I mean, my understanding was that weren't there German operatives around that area? Wasn't there something influenced by the United States itself involved at all?
The question has to do with whether there was more to it than just the political differences and anguish within the Cuban government at that time, please.
Well, the main reason is the political atmosphere in Cuba, but also Cuba became a little bit different in 1938, 1939. I'm talking about the population. The population became more and more anti-immigrants and anti-Jewish, during those 2 years of the 1930s, because Germany actually sent agitators in Cuba, like in other countries, including the United States, to try to make sure that there would not be more immigrants there. It's not the only reason; it's just a combination of reasons. Excuse me. This combined with the domestic political situation in Cuba, was not in favor of the St. Louis passengers or the other passengers on other boats, but mostly it's the decree issued by the president.
Thank you very much. You had a question, yes, please.
Was it known at the time the fate that they were likely to go back to? Was there any evidence that Roosevelt and Morgenthau knew about the existence of death camps?
Was it known at the time what might happen to the people if they were sent back?
Well, there were. We are in 1939. There is no death camp at that time, but the government, the U.S. government, knows about the concentration camps in Germany in 1939. But again, I mean, that for all the reasons that I mentioned, they couldn't do anything, based on those policies. The only thing that could have happened would have been basically making an exception for that particular boat, for those 900 people, making that exception because most of them had registered on the quota list. So it would have made basically a legal precedent from the government perspective. But I have to say, I want to mention something that I didn't have time to mention during the PowerPoint. What I told you about the decision of the United States is actually from the government perspective, but from the population level, it's a little bit different. We talked about anti-Semitism, but there is also another side that I like to mention, also to balance, because it's not black and white, it's more, a lot of shades of gray. There are at the National Archives in Washington, in College Park in Maryland. There are many, many letters from American people, letters and telegrams sent to either Roosevelt or the State Department asking for asking them to let them in. For political reason, for historical reason, for religious reason. So you could see in those letters and telegrams the generosity of the American people on the individual level. And some of them even said, I have a big house and I can actually welcome a family of 4, or I have a company or I have enough land and I can actually hire some people to come here, because they couldn't become a public charge for the United States. So, when I tell the story and when I have more time, I usually try to balance this and I try to tell the story from different perspectives and levels. So I wanted to.
Yes, please.
I'd like to ask Professor a question. You talked about the reaction in the United States. What about in Cuba? We have somebody who was there at that time. The feeling of the Cuban people, how do they feel about that? And we have Madame here, if you'd like to tell that. She was 13 years old.
Well, please.
I remember reading the newspaper. We were very, very concerned what was happening on the port. And we wanted them to stay, from what I heard, relatives and friends. But there was nothing the government was doing.
There was nothing that the government was doing, but that the Cuban people you knew were in fact interested in what was happening. Right. Thank you very much. Very interesting. Yes, ma'am.
What was the reaction, or did anyone know of the reaction within Germany that the St. Louis was?
What was the reaction within Germany? Do we know anything about that, Martin?
Well, as you might imagine, the German propaganda machine went into high gear. Joseph Goebbels, when it was discovered that the St. Louis was turning back to Europe, made hay of the fact that we'll have to take, as he put it, we'll have to take these shabby Jews back and we'll deal with them. And the world figured out soon thereafter what that meant. No less a figure than Adolf Hitler himself mockingly wrote of the reaction to the St. Louis. I can only hope and expect that the other world, which has such deep sympathy for these Jewish criminals, will at least be generous enough to convert their sympathy into practical aid. We, on our part, are ready to place these criminals at the disposal of other countries, even for all I care, on luxury ships. So here is Adolf Hitler, again mocking the West for supposedly being so concerned about the Jews and yet not taking them in.
Excellent. Thank you, Martin. We have time for 2 more questions. Yes, ma'am. And then in the back. Okay.
I wonder if you could say something about the political situation. There was the isolationist element was very strong in the United States at that time. Would you care to comment on how that influenced the decision?
The point is, what is the feeling within the U.S. taking into account a strong isolationist sentiment? I would like to pass that on, or I'd be happy to try it also. Well, we know from a number of recent books that isolationist sentiment was very strong. Roosevelt did feel it. Roosevelt was very sensitive politically to what it is that he was capable of doing and not doing. In 1938, he had been slapped down in an effort to expand the courts. And Roosevelt, in that period of time, was rather vulnerable. We don't think of him now, as we look back, as a vulnerable president, as an awe-inspiring president, 4 terms and all of that. But in that period of time, he did feel his vulnerability. He was cautious. And I suspect that if the issue came before him, just very specifically, you've got 900 Jews on a ship, my gut feeling is he'd have said, no, let's move on. There are more important things to deal with. One more question? Yes, ma'am.
My question is about to any of you. What do you think about changing the mentality of American Jews or American society as whole? Because
Changing the mentality of American Jews?
I am former Soviet Jew who was saved, so to speak, by every day, month by month, demonstration of American Jews and Americans, not Jews only, in 70s and 80s. And I think, was it just changing the mentality, or it took one person only, like Senator Jackson, to push the process? And our suffering in Soviet Union, yeah, it was, but nothing to compare with Shoah time. That's why I wonder, and media was not like you mentioned. These days, media can live report, whatever.
Yes.
In 70s and 80s, it still was much less media. How then American Jews and Americans demonstrate?
Right. Your point is, I believe, that how is it possible to change the mentality of the American people or American Jewry? Big time question involving a good bit of time, but I'd be happy to ask Dr. Affumato if she has a thought about that. Or Martin, would you like to make a comment about that? I want to be responsive to your question.
Again, I'd like to echo what Dr. Affumato said, that there was something of a hue and cry over the St. Louis. There were front page stories above the fold in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in the first few days of June 1939, when the ship was off the coast of Florida and waiting for word as to whether it might be allowed to disembark its passengers. And Hollywood celebrities, among them Edward G. Robinson, sent telegrams to the White House requesting the Roosevelt administration to allow the boat to land. But once the boat was heading back to Europe, there began a debate in the Jewish community, which is still going on today. There were editorials in the Jewish Daily Forward and other Jewish media about what at least one editorialist referred to as the shameful conduct of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. Dr. Afamadu mentioned Lawrence Berenson, who was charged with negotiating with the Cuban government. And President Brew at one point said, all right, give us $500 per St. Louis passenger, or a total of $453,000, and we will allow them to land. And Lawrence Berenson came back and said, well, I think this is a little bit of Latin American horse trading, so I will offer $443,000. In other words, $10,000 less. And at that, President Brew felt insulted and said, all right, the negotiations are over. The St. Louis must leave Cuban waters tomorrow. So for a figure of $10,000 or $11 per passenger, those negotiations broke down. So even then, there was debate within the Jewish community as to whether or not everything proper had been done.
Thank you, Martin, very much. The remarkable thing for me, and I'm sure many others, about this St. Louis story is that if you examine the American media throughout the course of World War II, editors did know what was going on in Europe. Very little of it did appear in the press. And I did a study once of the New York Times coverage throughout World War II. And what is remarkable is that the New York Times, a New York paper owned by the Sulzberger family, did its very best to bury the story. When they had information that 1.5 million Jews had been killed, information that was very reliable, came from good sources in Switzerland, passed on through London to New York. At that time, the information was there. That's a front page story. It was put on page 17 and lowered to 3 or 4 paragraphs. So there's something not only about the mood of the American people, which Martin had referred to in various polling data, but what is it that the media, reflecting the mood of the American people, was actually doing? It was not its most glorious day. But I have a feeling that here at the Library of Congress, we've hit a glorious moment. And I want to thank it, and I want to thank our panelists very much for participating. Thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. If we can wait one moment. She was on the ship as a very young baby and would like to say.
Sorry. By way of defense of the United States, and I'm a very proud citizen of the United States by choice, I would like to commend Congress for finally, after 70 years, passing a resolution that apologizes to St. Louis survivors for having turned us away in 1939. So I guess maybe the United States saw its ways and found it in their power to apologize. And I thank you all, and the document is in the Library of Congress.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.